Join us for this presentation. As Jamila mentioned, one of my favorite things to talk about and to work on is looking after athletes as a whole person. And that includes a lot of self-care, which, as we'll get into today, is not always been top of the list in the sporting arena. So if I can just tell you a little bit more about myself, as Jamila mentioned, I do work in this space, have been doing so for about a decade. I'm very fortunate to work with really wonderful athletes and teams, including Olympians, pro teams, D1 universities, folks who are sort of coming out of high school and heading into those paths as well. And it's a really wonderful thing to do and a group of people to spend time with. And part of my passion, as Jamila mentioned, is coming from the fact that I was an athlete in my youth. And that comes with a lot of different experiences. And I think because of the era in which I was an athlete, I grew up sporting wise in a certain culture. And that is also, I think, the culture that a lot of current day coaches and family members of youth athletes today grew up in. And so we were surrounded by a collection of now very old-fashioned technology, if we had any, really bad freaking haircuts, the shell suit, which thankfully, even with the reemergence of 80s and 90s fashion, is not making a repeat experience. And a concept around sporting performance that really involved things like no pain, no gain, emotions are weak. Suck it up, buttercup was one I heard a lot as a kid in England. No crying in baseball. If you had interests outside of your sport, that seemed to be a sign of non-commitment. If you had feelings, you weren't tough enough. And so this was kind of the era that athletes in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s were exposed to. And whilst I'm hope and feel that the arena has changed a little bit in that regard, I want to acknowledge that, like me working in this space, a lot of, again, the current coaches, the family members of current youth athletes were immersed in this, and that sort of influences the way perhaps that they approach sport and youth athletes these days. And unfortunately, that era that sort of didn't attend to mental health or considered it separate from sporting performance or just didn't know it was a thing that we needed to attend to really won't be ignored. We are looking at really startling numbers of young people who are dealing with mental health concerns. As you can see here, around 18% of kids under the age of 8 and nearly 50% of adolescents, so folks, in their teen years, dealing with a mental health challenge. And the ones that I see most often in my work are symptoms and diagnoses of depression, anxiety, substance use and abuse, disordered eating, and body image issues. And that can't be ignored if we want to have healthy athletes. And as I say, fortunately, the environment, I think, has evolved a little bit to better respect and try and care for the whole athlete. Now, part of why we see all these mental health conditions arising in young people is they are increasingly under a lot of stresses, right? A lot of things, a lot of factors in a young person's life that can cause significant stress. And when that stress isn't handled, can develop into some of these conditions, can lead to burnout in their sport because their body and mind can only take so much at a given time. And so for all young people, they're dealing with a lot. Young athletes, those of you who are watching will know this unfortunately too well, but you've got a lot of things going on, whether that's school and academic pressures, what your family wants from you, what your friends want from you. There might be money issues at home. You might eat badly. I certainly ate terribly as a kid and didn't know any better. We might be using substances. Certainly, caffeine is rife, if nothing else. We're not sleeping well. We have social media, and Namely, I feel incredibly fortunate that I didn't have to deal with that as a teen. I think it would have probably crushed me. And so young people are dealing with all of this stuff before they, even get on a court or get into their sporting arena, arrive at practice. And some folks would say that being involved in sport is good for your mental health. And it absolutely is, right? Exercise, we know, is really good for the brain and relieving stress. Perhaps being in a supportive environment, having teammates, having fun, having something that you can be proud of can really buffer against these stresses. But as we all probably know, there's also a lot of strain that comes with being in sports. So for every time there's a supportive environment, there's an unsupportive environment. For every time we win and feel all that success, there's a loss. And so just being involved in sport can in itself add extra pressure. And if we're not attending to that and looking at that, I think we're really underserving our youth athletes, and they're not getting the full and amazingly beneficial experience that a positive sporting career can have on a young person. So when we think about theories of what makes an athlete do their best, right? What helps them perform in those knockout ways that we're all really in awe of. A lot of the theories, a lot of the ways that coaches are working, or the arena of sports is focused on in terms of peak performance, really are focused on just the sporting aspect, right? Training the skills, training the conditioning, getting out there and doing that thing. One of the approaches to performance that I feel like really tries to include the whole person, not just those sporting performance elements, is a very famous one by wonderful, wonderful coach John Wooden. He talked about the pyramid of success, which, as you can see here, includes things that aren't necessarily uh, traditionally thought of as peak performance models. So there's caring about friendship, caring about enthusiasm, caring about team spirit. So he believed that all of those things contributed to competitive greatness, contributed to athletes having those knockout successes. But even this model doesn't account for physical and mental health. And so that really is, in my experience, the underpinning of this all. You can't work on things like friendship and enthusiasm and self-control and intentness and skill if you don't have the foundation of physical and mental health. And the things that contribute to physical mental health tend to be the things that traditionally the sporting world has sidelined or given less attention to, right? So things like sleep, rest, recovery, which is critical to performance, critical to our well-being, critical to our mental health, but often gets sidelined in favor of more training, volume, getting out there with the team. And so things like sleep and rest have been sidelined. Things like having a multifaceted identity, which is a fancy way of saying having other interests, having other things in our life over and above just our sport. That's really important, I think, for people to feel well in themselves, and also for the days when that sport isn't going well, right? We need to have these other parts of us so that we are not crushed by a win or a loss. That also, as I mentioned, in earlier periods of sport and youth sport, was kind of thought of as not being fully committed if you had other interests. Um, Things like actually enjoying activities were considered unimportant in the past, and yet we know all evidence, all research shows in mental health and in performance that having enjoyment of the way that you spend your time is critical. Supportive relationships, having manageable stress levels, not having illness, right? Being able to recover if we do get a physical ailment, being able to spend time working on our mental health and reducing any mental illness. So all these things that have been typically sidelined in the world of peak performance are actually the prerequisite for everything that everyone is trying to push and focus on in sports. And so this is where self-care comes in, and the name of this presentation today. Using self-care is a way that we can buffer against all the stresses that we face in life, whoever we are, and then also help us boost our well-being. So what is self-care? You can see the definition here. It's really taking an active role in our own well-being and our happiness, and particularly in a time of extra stress. And I tend to think of self-care as being one of two categories of self-care: sexy self-care and unsexy self-care. Sexy self-care is the stuff that feels good whilst we're doing it and is good for us after. Unsexy self-care is the stuff that perhaps we don't enjoy whilst doing it, but is good for us afterwards. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment or two. But I think we can probably all think of something right now that is fun to do and good for us afterwards. We can probably all think of something that is fun to do and bad for us afterwards as well. That does not count as self-care. But also things that probably aren't that enjoyable to do, but make us feel better, are healthy for us afterwards. And so one of the ways that we can care for ourselves, so an unsexy form of self-care, I think, is in helping athletes, helping ourselves, helping young people respond to the stresses that they are experiencing. So this is a stressful situation is happening. We've already missed the moment to prevent it if there was one. And now we're just dealing with, okay, how do we limit the impact of this stressor? And so our brain tends to go through a process of trying to address a stressor, so something negative that's happening to us. It wants to ask if it's important, is this really a threat to me, and do I have any skills to handle it? Now, in a panicked, under pressure moment, our brain normally comes up with this is incredibly important to me, and I have zero skills to handle it. And that normally is not the exact truth. So trying to slow this process down and really take a minute, or help our athletes take a minute to ask themselves, how important really is this thing to me? Is not being in this part of the game life or death to me? Is it going to really kind of impact things for me? And the answer may be yes, but oftentimes it's not as important as the brain would most quickly have us believe. Then the second thing that can help in managing that stressor is asking ourselves, do I have experience with this? Have I managed something like this before? Have I got any skills, ability, past examples that could help me handle this now? And again, oftentimes we do have, right? Most stressful experiences, there'll be things that we've done before that can help in those moments. So asking folks, okay, what did you do last time you didn't get to play? And how did you come back from that? How did you handle it? How did you manage it? Knowing that you have some tools, knowing that this isn't life and death, can make things feel less impactful, less burdensome. So that's a sort of unsexy piece of self-care, like really trying to manage a stressful event as it's happening to you with some extra thought and drawing on your previous experiences. Another relatively unsexy part of self-care that's related to that is helping us put things in perspective. So this is a technique that we call the 10-10-10-10 perspective, which is when something is happening or we're feeling really bad about something. I missed a shot in that last quarter. I ask myself, how much will I care about this particular thing in 10 hours? Sometimes when it was me, ooh, if I really felt like I made an error in 10 hours, I will still care quite a bit, maybe a little bit less than right now. How much will I care about this in 10 days? I'll probably be significantly better feeling in 10 days, like other things will have happened, other things will have filled that space or made me feel better. I'll have gone to a practice or two, I might have had another game. How much will I care about this in 10 weeks? How much will I care in 10 months? And often what this process of asking ourselves will do is just remind ourselves that, again, even though our brain and body like to treat everything like a crisis and an emergency at times, that not everything is going to be life and death. Some things, of course, will still be incredibly stressful and impactful for us throughout our lives. You know, a major grief, of course, will not feel better, perhaps, but most of the things that we encounter in our sporting life will feel better over time, and this can help remind us. Now to some of the more fun self-cares. So here's a list of things that come to mind for me when I think about self-care. So you've got a little bit of everything in here, doing some crafts, hanging out with a friend, baking cookies, reading a book, taking a shower, some of the unsexy stuff. You might not enjoy tidying your room, but damn, does it feel good once it's clean and tidy. So you've got those opportunities to kind of pick and choose a few self-care activities. Now, what I would encourage for those of you here and for those of you watching is to just take a minute right now for yourself and jot down any things that you do right now that perhaps aren't on this list, that now that we know what self-care kind of is, what it means, count as self-care for you. So take that moment now and I'll pause whilst you think about, okay, things that I do that I enjoy whilst I'm doing them and that feel good later on too. Things that I don't necessarily enjoy whilst I'm doing them, but feel good or are good for me later on. Just take a minute and jot down any additional ideas that you might have. Hopefully you're getting some good ideas or being able to label things that you already do and identify that they are self-care. Sometimes these things can be seemingly really small. You might be able to tell from my accent, I'm originally from England. For those of you who don't know, uh, England and British folks have a stereotype of being kind of obsessed with drinking tea. And unfortunately, I do not break that stereotype. I love tea. And so, one of my self cares, small as it may sound, is I have fancy tea and what I call boring tea. So, I need boring tea just because I drink tea, that's my drink of choice. But then I have fancy tea that I treat myself to in the afternoon. So before I start my afternoon work with clients, I will take 5 minutes, make this fancy ass overpriced tea that I have, and enjoy drinking it. Now, is that highfalutin, super fun, super sexy? Probably not for most people, but it's a little thing that I do that kind of comforts me and gives me a little breather. And so even those small things count. And I think that's important to note because I think also when we talk about self-care and when I talk about it with athletes, they're like, sounds great, Kim, but like, have you seen my schedule? For example, student athletes, I think, have the busiest schedule I've ever seen, busier than my pro athletes, because they're juggling so many things. And so they're like, yeah, Kim, sounds super cool, but where am I meant to put this in? I don't have time for that. And so, how you actually get these things into your daily life is really a matter of planning at times. So, if we actually think ahead and plan to bring in self-care activities, that increases the likelihood of us getting to them, right? Even just the thinking ahead about what I might do when. So, certainly making a mental plan is really useful in finding ways to fit this self-care in. Secondly, agreeing to do it with another person really helps find the space and the time. Those of you who are more social might really enjoy this, right? Self-care might be actually hanging out with your friends, doing something with another person, or it might be that you both agree to do something that isn't particularly social, but together, right? We might get together and just read quietly. We might get together and just walk together. Those of us who are a little more introverted, such as myself, a lot of my self-care really needs to be done alone for me to feel the benefit of it. So bear in mind your personal preferences as to how you recuperate. The definition for those of you who aren't quite sure on extrovert, introvert is not about whether you like people or not, or whether you are shy or confident. It's the way that you refill your energy pile. Uh, you are either energized by spending time with people, or you are more re-energized by spending time alone. I need alone time to re-energize. So if you benefit from spending time with other people, agreeing to do some of these self-cares with them can be really helpful. And then, sounds silly to say, but schedule it, right? Schedule your cup of tea, schedule your walk, schedule your game time. Because if you put it in your schedule like an appointment, it's going to remind you, A, that you wanted to do it, but B, it's going to hold that space for you a little bit. So hopefully people won't book over it, or at least when they're like, okay, practice is going to be at this time, or now you need to go for massage at this time, or weights at this time, you at least see when they put those things in that you had an alternate plan for yourself and you can adjust it. So I think actually writing it into your schedule at least keeps it in mind when changes do get made that force it around. If those changes don't get made and it just stays in your schedule, then great. When that time rolls around, you have an appointment with yourself that is just as important as any appointment with a coach, a trainer, a teacher. So find those spots and try to hold them for yourself. And then, as I mentioned with my tea drinking ritual, there's no amount of self-care that is not valuable. So if you only have 2 minutes for yourself, you only have 10 minutes, you only have 30 minutes of downtime in the evening, it's really easy to get into the mindset of, well, that won't make any difference. And the truth is that it will, right? It might not change the world for you, but given that the way that our mental health is formed and broken down is really about increases in stress. So over time, a number of small stresses can trigger these kind of bigger mental health concerns, as can one super intense single stressor. But typically, it's about when we meet a trigger level of stress, right? We can no longer cope with it. That's when things get really gnarly for us. But even if we get just 2 minutes of self-care, it can bring down the level of stress just enough to stay sort of under that trigger point where it all starts to go a little bit haywire. So will that 2 minutes take us all the way back down to no stress and completely zen and everything is amazing? Probably not. Will it give us a little bit more room to operate in before the stress gets to a level that it's really crippling for us? Yes, hopefully so. So 2 minutes is a valuable 2 minutes. But the other thing I want to say about this is when we are really tight on time, we need to be a little bit strategic around how we are getting our self-care in. So, for example, for me, I don't know why, but I love all the trashy dating shows. Love Island, particularly, is one of my favorite. I think possibly because it originated in the UK. So I hear a lot of British accents when I listen to the English one. So I can watch 3 hours of Love Island. It's one of my favorite things, like a really nice long marathon Netflix session. But those 3 hours will feel as restful and restorative as 10 minutes of doing deep breathing, meditating. Now, Love Island, much more fun to do, but if I only have 10 minutes of time in my day, realistically, I'm going to get a lot more bang for my buck, a lot more benefit from 10 minutes of breathing than I am 10 minutes of Love Island. Because Love Island, for it to work, I need multiple episodes. So you can probably imagine for yourself things that, yeah, are really great and really relaxing or really refill you and re-energize you, but they might take a longer period of time than you have, let's say, on Tuesday. And so that might be something, if that's like a hike or a movie or a date or a really good friend hangout, like it might be we need to plan that for when we have more time and also find things for those shorter spaces. So thinking strategically about how we do our self-care. And so now I want to give you the opportunity to try and pencil in some self-cares for yourself. So now this might be from the earlier list that I had. This might be from things that you've jotted down. And I want you to try and think about daily, right? Think about a busy day for you. What daily could I fit in that might give me just a little bit of comfort, a little bit of relief, a little bit of rest, or a little bit of re-energizing. And we want at least 3 of those in a day. So mine again might be my fancy ass cup of tea. When I walk my dog, I walk deliberately down the pretty street. Sounds small, but that's what always reminds me to take a deep breath and appreciate all the flowers. And then I also typically try and find time for, at the end of the day, my little nighttime routine, which these days involves a lot of skincare and music whilst I do it. So those are sort of my classic daily ones. But then you also want to have weekly ones, right? The ones that we maybe don't have time for day to day. This might be where I put my Love Island binges, so something more substantial there. So see if you can fill in 2 or 3 there. And then monthly, these are the more significant ones, right? That might be a whole day away, like you might go to like the amusement park, or you might go and watch a different team play. So these are those bigger time commitments. So take a moment now and see if you can jot down for you some daily, weekly, and monthly self-cares. And I'll pause there for a moment whilst you do. You've been able to identify a few for your daily, weekly, and monthly. As we were talking about earlier, see if you can put them in your schedule. Block them out a little bit for yourself. Get it clear what that's going to look like for you tomorrow, what it's going to look like for you this week, what it's going to look like for you this month in your schedule. One of the best self-cares, and by best I mean one that tends to give a pretty significant bang for buck in that it takes a short amount of time and helps settle most people's nervous system really rapidly, is deep breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. That's the one that I recommend to really all of my athletes because we all sometimes need a moment to just resettle or take a pause. And that's a form of self-care that you can take with you everywhere. So for athletes that are traveling, athletes that are often in lots of different spaces, the classroom, the practice court, the gym, the bus, the other team's arena, having something that you can carry with you everywhere is an incredibly useful self-care. And so that deep breathing, that diaphragmatic breathing, is really just the opportunity to breathe in and out of the belly more than the chest. That essentially is what we're doing. So we breathe in to inflate the belly and breathe out to deflate the belly. So if I can leave you with one takeaway, it is that self-care looks different for everyone. I guess I'm going to have multiple takeaways. I take that back. Multiple takeaways. Self-care looks different for everyone, right? What works for me isn't necessarily going to be enjoyable or feel good afterwards for somebody else. So you get to be the only person who assesses whether your self-care is valid self-care or not. Two, we need it, right? This is the underpinning of your mental health, and your mental health is a prerequisite for everything else your sport requires you to do. And I think if we could all really take time to attend to those self-cares, take time to look after our physical and mental health, what we find is that our performance improves, right? We have more physical energy, more physical capability, we get less injured, we tend to have more motivation, more consistent ability to perform in our training spaces, in our practice spaces, the ability to focus more, the ability to control our headspace a little bit more. So there's really a myriad of benefits to taking care of our own self. And because of the performance benefits of that, even the most cynical coach, even the most cynical sports performance coach should be able to see the benefit of looking after their athlete in these more gentle ways that have been in the past sidelined by our field. And so with that, I would just say if anyone has any questions about anything I've talked about today or anything in the sport, mental health, and mental performance spaces, do feel free to reach out. I always love to hear from athletes and from coaches, and these are my contact details should anyone wish to get in touch. So thank you very much for being here today.